The girl was sitting quietly in first class. She still had her ticket. The seat number was clearly displayed 1A. But then a voice rang out loud enough for everyone in the compartment to hear, "Please stand up. This seat is not for you." There was no shouting, no commotion, just a very young black girl, and dozens of eyes staring at her as if she had done something wrong. If it were you, what would you do? Would you get up and end it all? Or would you stay and accept the judgmental stares of the entire airplane cabin? What makes this story heartbreaking isn't the chair itself. It's the silent question behind it. If you don't have power, if you don't have status, will you be treated fairly? The girl had to make a choice, a very quiet choice, but one that was enough to shake an entire system. If you've ever been judged solely on your appearance, or been asked to move aside in your own life, then this story is for you. Stay with us. And if you feel this story resonates with something familiar, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to begin this journey together. The voice wasn't too loud, but it was sharp enough, and cold enough to make the entire first-class cabin suddenly feel heavy. "Miss, you need to stand up now." Naomi Brooks lifted her head, her ears still ringing from the sound of the auxiliary engine outside the plane. She had only been seated for less than 3 minutes. The spacious, cream-colored leather seat still smelled of the clean cleaning solution. The entertainment screen in front of her was still black. A bottle of water sat neatly beside her seat, unopened. Naomi still had the boarding pass in her hand. She looked at the flight attendant standing in front of her, Linda Hayes, senior flight attendant, her hair neatly tied back, her uniform immaculate, one hand on her hip, the other holding an electronic logbook. Her gaze was not questioning. It was the gaze of someone who had already made up their mind. "What's wrong?" Naomi asked. Her voice was low but not shaky. Linda didn't answer immediately. She glanced quickly to her right, where a family of 3 was standing blocking the aisle. The blonde woman wearing a beige cashmere coat had her lips pressed together. The middle-aged man stood beside her holding a carry-on suitcase. Their son, about 19 or 20 years old, had a flushed face from discomfort. Linda turned to look at Naomi. "This seat isn't for you. You need to get out of here immediately." The atmosphere seemed to freeze. A few other passengers looked up. Some took off their headphones. Some subtly shifted in their seats to get a better look. No one said anything. On an airplane, silence often means being left out. Naomi bent down to look at the ticket in her hand. Seat 1A, first class, Northway Airlines, flight NW 482, JFK to London Heathrow. She knew she wasn't mistaken. "This is my seat," Naomi said slowly. "It says so on the ticket." Linda let out a sigh, very softly but loud enough for Naomi to hear. It wasn't a sigh of exhaustion. Rather, it was something akin to impatience. "There's been a misunderstanding," Linda replied. "We need to rearrange the seating. Please stand up." Naomi felt her cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but because that familiar feeling was returning. The feeling of being compelled to explain her own presence. She glanced quickly around the compartment. The first-class seats were identical, arranged in small, private compartments. Most of the other passengers were already seated. They wore expensive suits, shirts, and sweaters. None of them resembled Naomi. A gray hoodie, black sweatpants, a canvas backpack neatly tucked under the seat. She knew she didn't look like them. The blonde woman spoke up. Her voice was slightly higher, loud enough to echo throughout the cabin. "We've been flying with this airline for over 10 years, she said, gesturing toward Linda, but her eyes fixed on Naomi. "My son can't sit in economy class. This is clearly a mistake." Naomi turned to look at her, just for a second. Then she turned away again. "I'm sorry," Naomi said, "but I don't think it's my fault." A snort came from the other family. "You're young," the middle-aged man said, his voice low and even. "You can sit anywhere. This flight is 8 hours long." 8 hours. Naomi swallowed hard. She had flown solo many times. She knew the difference between 8 hours in economy class and 8 hours in first class. But what weighed heavily on her chest wasn't the inconvenience. It was the way they spoke, as if her comfort was something to be traded. Linda leaned towards Naomi, lowering her voice. "Miss, you're slowing down the boarding process. We need to resolve this quickly." The word quickly is emphasized as a subtle warning. Naomi looked Linda straight in the eyes. "No challenge, no plea. I'm not trying to slow down," she said. "I'm just sitting in my seat." A long silence followed, a few seconds. but long enough for Naomi to feel the gazes of those around her. Some looked annoyed, some were curious, some avoided eye contact. No one was on her side. Linda stood up straight. "Miss Brooks," she said, looking at the screen in her hand. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call the captain." The words fell into the compartment like a heavy object. Naomi felt her heart race. She thought of her father, Marcus Brooks, and how he always told her to stay calm, to understand that the world isn't always fair, but that she always had a choice in how she reacted. She clutched the ticket tightly in her hand. "I understand," Naomi said, "but I'm not going to get up." The first-class cabin was eerily silent. At the back of the compartment, a man took off his glasses and shook his head very slightly. Another woman pursed her lips. No one spoke. Linda looked at Naomi, her gaze no longer filled with impatience. It had shifted to something more resolute. "Then you're causing trouble," she said, "and that could lead to more serious consequences." Naomi didn't answer. She just sat there, in seat 1A, in the same position. And for the first time that morning she wondered, was standing here worth it all? Naomi Brooks didn't grow up in rooms filled with applause. Her childhood was filled with quiet afternoons where sunlight fell slowly on the old wooden floor and her father's deep, even voice echoed from the kitchen. Marcus Brooks wasn't a talkative person. He rarely gave lengthy lectures, but every word he spoke carried weight, as if he had thought it through carefully before uttering it. Naomi remembers one evening many years ago very clearly. She was only 11 years old, returning home after a school day where her teacher had misunderstood her. No one scolded her, but the suspicious gaze made her feel small. She cried, silently. She just sat huddled on the sofa, tears soaking into her sleeves. Marcus Brooks sat opposite her holding a cup of now cold tea. He didn't rush to ask any questions. He waited until Naomi looked up. "Do you know why people suspect you?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. "Because I did something wrong?" she asked again, her voice hesitant. Marcus smiled very slightly. "No," he said. "Because they don't understand you, and sometimes they don't want to understand." The words weren't comforting, but they were honest. And Naomi remembered them. Marcus Brooks was a black man who had walked through enough rooms where he was the only one who didn't look like everyone else. He started his career in a small warehouse in New Jersey where he unloaded packages himself. No large capital, no powerful connections. Only discipline and one unwavering principle: don't make noise, do it right. Naomi grew up in that atmosphere. No one taught her to prove herself better than others, nor did anyone teach her to bow her head to be safe. What Marcus taught her was something far more difficult: to maintain her dignity when no one is there to protect her. "You don't need to win every argument," he once said, "but you need to know where you stand." Naomi remembered those early mornings when Marcus would drop her off at school before heading to his office. The radio played the morning economic news. Naomi didn't understand all the numbers, but she was familiar with the rhythm. Calm, controlled, unpretentious. Marcus never told Naomi that he was the CEO of a major airline logistics corporation. He didn't see the need. To him, the title only mattered in the boardroom. At home, he was just a father, and Naomi is just a little girl. She was taught how to prepare her own breakfast, how to double-check her assignments before submitting them, how to apologize when she was wrong, and how to say no when she was right. There were no lessons about using power to oppress others. So, as Naomi sat in first class on flight NW482, what confused her wasn't Linda Hayes's request. It was a very familiar feeling rising in her chest, the feeling of years gone by. When others looked at her and automatically came to a conclusion, Naomi wasn't experiencing this for the first time. She was once asked to check her bag when leaving a store while others weren't. She was once asked for her student ID by a security guard at the university library, even though she was sitting in the VIP section. Small things, no one would call it discrimination. But each time Naomi had to ask herself, was she overthinking things? Her father called it the gray area. "Many things in life aren't big enough to warrant a lawsuit," Marcus once said, "but small enough to wear you down." Naomi understands that gray area very well. She also understood why she dressed the way she did. A loose hoodie, dark sweatpants, no prominent logos, no jewelry. Not because she had no other choices, but because she preferred simplicity. She didn't want to draw attention to things that didn't reflect who she truly was. But today, that very simplicity seems to have become an excuse. Naomi sat upright in seat 1A, her hands resting on her lap. She could clearly hear her heartbeat, not too fast, but enough to remind her that she was living in the moment and that this moment had meaning. She remembered the evening before the flight. Marcus stood in the kitchen, cutting fruit. Naomi sat at the table looking out the window. Outside New York City was as noisy as ever. "Are you sure you want to fly alone?" Marcus asked. Naomi nodded. "I want to do it myself," she said. Marcus didn't object. He simply nodded as he always did when respecting his daughter's decision. "Remember one thing," he said without looking at Naomi. "If you're in the right place, you don't need to ask permission to exist." That statement sounded perfectly normal at the time. But now, with Linda Hayes standing before her with the Carter family looking at her as if she were a tiny obstacle on their path to comfort, that statement resonated more clearly than ever. Naomi didn't feel like she was fighting anyone. She was just staying where she was. She knew that if she stood up now, no one in the cabin would remember her. The flight would take off. The other family would be happy. Linda Hayes would continue her shift. No consequences, no fuss. And Naomi will carry that familiar feeling with her once again. That feeling had stayed with her for years. The feeling of stepping aside to make things easier for others. Naomi looked out the window. Outside, the ground was still nearby. The plane hadn't started moving yet. Nothing was impossible to change. She wondered very softly in her mind. If I stand up, what am I teaching myself? No one heard the question. No one answered it for her. This wasn't a heroic moment. There was no background music, no spotlights, just a 17-year-old girl sitting in a chair she'd paid for, weighing short-term comfort against something bigger but vague. Naomi took a deep breath. Then she exhaled slowly. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't get up out of fear, and in that very brief moment, a silent change took place inside her. No one saw it, but it was there, clear, firm. Just like Marcus Brooks always stood firm even when no one applauded. The first-class cabin on flight NW482 is designed to create a sense of privacy. It's not just spatial separation, but a separation of living states. Soft lighting, thick carpets, the scent of new leather mixed with the subtle citrus fragrance from warm towels. Everything is calculated so that those sitting here feel they are stepping into another world. A quieter world. A slower world. And in a way, a more worthwhile one. Naomi Brooks realized that the moment she walked in, she wasn't overwhelmed, nor was she excited. She simply observed. As she always did when entering spaces where she knew, even if no one said so, that she wasn't a familiar figure. The other passengers were seated. A man in his 50s was typing emails on his laptop. An elderly couple whispered to each other, their voices low enough to maintain politeness. A woman in a dark blue blazer had her eyes closed, her noise-canceling headphones covering both ears. No one said anything, but Naomi felt the gaze. Not a hostile gaze, not blatant scrutiny, rather a fleeting glance, then lingering for half a second longer than usual, as if the brain were trying to piece together a mismatched image into a familiar picture. Naomi was used to it. She neatly placed her backpack under the seat, adjusting the zipper so it wouldn't obstruct the walkway. She did everything slowly and deliberately. She didn't want to draw attention. She didn't want to give anyone a reason to speak up. As soon as she sat down in seat 1A, she heard footsteps behind her. The Carter family. Evelyn Carter entered the compartment with the gait of someone accustomed to being given priority. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't look around. As if she didn't need confirmation that she belonged there. Richard Carter followed, pulling his suitcase. Lucas Carter walked more slowly, his eyes scanning the compartment quickly, pausing at Naomi for just a moment, then moving on. Naomi didn't turn around, but she knew they were there. She heard Evelyn whisper something. The words were unclear, but she recognized the tone. It was the voice of someone unhappy because something hadn't gone as expected. Linda Hayes appeared shortly after them, a professional smile on her face. She greeted the Carter family in a slightly friendlier tone than she had spoken to Naomi. The difference was subtle, but Naomi noticed. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, Linda Noy. Let me help you with that." Naomi looked down at her hand. She was still holding her boarding pass. She hadn't put it away yet. Part of her thought that keeping it in her hand would make things simpler, clearer. She didn't want to have to explain. Evelyn Carter stopped right next to seat 1A. She looked down at Naomi. She said nothing. She just stared, like someone staring at a misplaced object. Naomi looked up. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Naomi felt neither anger nor fear. She only felt a familiar sensation creeping in. The feeling of being judged without words. "Evelyn Quay," sang Linda. "Where is my son's chair?" she asked. Linda looked at the device in her hand, quickly swiping the screen. "Lucas is assigned to 22C, ma'am," Linda replied. Evelyn frowned. Very slightly, but enough for Linda to notice. "That's impossible," Evelyn said. "We always sit together. There must be a mistake." Linda smiled, but her smile had changed. It was no longer a welcoming smile. Instead, it was the smile of someone about to handle a difficult situation. "Let me double-check," Linda said. Naomi heard a rapid scrolling sound on the screen. Then Linda looked up. Her gaze rested on Naomi. Not for long, but long enough for Naomi to realize something had changed. In that moment, Naomi felt she was no longer just a passenger. She had become a variable, one option. Linda stepped closer. "Miss," she said, her voice still polite, "could you please show me your boarding pass again?" Naomi held out the ticket. She said nothing. She let Linda read it herself. Linda looked, then looked again. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Where did you check in?" Linda asked. "Online," Naomi replied. "Last night. Are you traveling alone?" "Yes." The questions came steadily. They didn't sound like an interrogation, but Naomi felt she was being held under an invisible light. Evelyn Carter crossed her arms over her chest. She said nothing, but her silence carried weight. Richard Carter glanced at his watch. Lucas sighed very softly. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked. Linda looked up. Her gaze swept over Naomi once more. It was the look of someone considering something. "It's just a rearrangement," Linda said. "We want to make sure all passengers are comfortable." Naomi understood how to use that word. Relaxed doesn't usually include her. She looked around the compartment. No one said anything. No one objected. No one acknowledged her right to be there. The silence wasn't malicious, but it allowed things to continue. Naomi recalled other occasions, once at the bookstore when the staff followed her every move, once at the scientific conference when a man asked if she was an assistant. Each time Naomi wondered whether she should speak up, and each time she weighed the choice between causing trouble and remaining silent. This first-class cabin is no different. It's just a bigger consequence. Linda leaned toward Evelyn Carter. "We're handling it," she said softly enough, for only the two of them to hear. But Naomi heard it, not with her ears, but with her senses. She realized that in this space, the default assumption was not on her side. Naomi placed her boarding pass on the small table in front of her. She left it there, opened it. Clear. No concealment. She said nothing more. She offered no explanation for why she was there. No mention of her father. No justification. She was simply present. As she had been for the past 17 years, Evelyn Carter let out a sigh, unable to hide her annoyance. "We're behind schedule," she said. "I don't understand why this is so complicated," Linda nodded. Then she turned to Naomi. "Miss Brooks," she said, her voice lowering, "could you please stand up for a moment so we can check the system again?" The remark sounded harmless. "Stand up for a moment." But Naomi knew. When you stand up, you've already given up half your seat. She looked at Linda, then at Evelyn, then down at her boarding pass. She remembered her father's words. "If you are in the right place, you don't need to ask permission to exist." Naomi shook her head very slightly. "You can sit here while I check," she said. "You won't be getting in anyone's way." Linda paused for a second. Not long, but long enough for the atmosphere to change. Some passengers began to pay more attention. The tension, though subtle, spread like a ripple of water. Evelyn Carter leaned toward Linda. "We can't let this go on," she said. "There are people here who have very tight schedules." Naomi heard it, and for the first time since entering the compartment, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, not from fear, but from familiarity. She wondered, had anyone in this compartment ever had to prove they deserved their seat? No one answered. Linda sat up straight. "Okay," she said. "I'll call the captain." The words fell heavy with emotion. Naomi sat still. Her hands rested on her lap. They were slightly cold, but not trembling. Outside the window, the New York sky remained a pale gray. The plane hadn't yet taken off. Time seemed to slow down. And in that moment, Naomi understood that things were about to enter a new phase. No more glances, no more vague questions, just direct power. She didn't know what she was going to face, But she knew that from this moment on, standing still was a worthwhile option. Evelyn Carter is not used to waiting. This was evident in the way she stood in the aisle of the first-class cabin, arms crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on Linda Hayes. Not an angry gaze. Rather the gaze of someone who believed that every delay was someone else's fault. Richard Carter stood beside his wife, silent. He didn't say much, but his presence carried a silent consent. When Evelyn spoke, Richard didn't object. When Evelyn was silent, Richard stood still. It was the kind of silence that made all actions legitimate, because no one was stopped. Lucas Carter leaned against the partition, headphones on, but his eyes still glanced toward seat 1A. He couldn't hide his discomfort, not because of the economy class seats, but because of the feeling of being excluded. For Lucas, not being allowed to sit there wasn't just inconvenient, it was an insult. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Linda," she said, using her first name as if they had known each other for a long time. "I don't understand why something so simple has become so complicated." Linda nodded slightly, maintaining a professional tone. "We are reviewing the system, ma'am." Evelyn tilted her head, her lips pressed together. "The system," she repeated. "Your systems are usually very fast, unless someone shouldn't be here." The statement didn't mention Naomi by name, but all eyes were on seat 1A. Naomi Brooks remained seated. She heard the words clearly, not with her ears, but with a heavy feeling that weighed down her chest. She inhaled, then exhaled. Slowly, controlled. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at Evelyn. Not because she was afraid, but because she understood that her gaze wasn't what Evelyn was looking for. Evelyn didn't want dialogue. She wanted results. "We paid for this compartment," Evelyn continued, "and my son can't sit in economy class. I think that's perfectly clear." Linda glanced quickly at Naomi, then turned back to look at Evelyn. "Seat 1A has been assigned," Linda said. "According to the manifest can be wrong," Evelyn interrupted. "That still happens." The way she said "it still happens" made the story sound familiar, as if this wasn't the first time she'd asked for something similar, and as if in the past, things had usually ended in her favor. Richard Carter has finally spoken out. "We have a tight schedule," he said, his voice low and even. "If necessary, we can speak with the manager." It wasn't a threat. At least it wasn't said that way. But Linda understood, and Naomi understood too. Such words often carry a series of unseen consequences. Linda nodded. "I'll call the captain," she said. "We'll sort this out right away." Naomi heard the emphasized, "right now." She placed her hand on her thigh, her fingers clenching slightly. She didn't want things to go this way, not because she was wrong, but because she knew that when power began to be invoked, truth was often no longer the only factor. Evelyn turned to Naomi again. "You're still very young," she said, her voice softening artificially. "You'll have plenty of other flights ahead of you. Don't make things more difficult." Naomi lifted her head. Her gaze was calm, not defiant, not submissive. "I'm not making things difficult," she replied. "I'm just sitting in my seat." Short answer. No explanation, no apology. Evelyn smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see," she said. At that moment, Naomi felt one thing clearly. The Carter family didn't see this as a dispute. They saw it as an arrangement that needed adjusting, and Naomi in their eyes was simply a flexible element. Linda turned her back and walked towards the cockpit. The sound of her shoes tapping softly on the thick carpet, one step at a time, filled the first-class cabin with an eerie silence. Several passengers glanced at their watches. A man in the distance sighed softly. A woman frowned, but then turned away. No one spoke. Naomi realized that this silence wasn't neutrality, it was convenience. People wanted the flight to depart on time, and if there was a problem, they wanted it to disappear quickly. How they didn't really care. Naomi looked down at the small table in front of her. The boarding pass was still there, clearly. There was no mistaking it. She wondered if everything had been decided on paper, would this have been over long ago? But the world doesn't always work that way. She recalled another time when she was younger. She and her father were in the elevator of an office building. A man stepped in, looked Marcus up and down, and then asked, "What department do you work in?" Marcus smiled politely and replied, "Not to prove anything, but to keep the pace of the day going." Later, when Naomi asked, Marcus simply said, "It's not always necessary to stop and correct every assumption." Naomi understood that, but she also understood that it wasn't always a good idea to just walk past. Evelyn Carter glanced at her watch again. "We're wasting time," she said. "I don't want this flight to be delayed because of a mistake." The way she emphasized the mistake made Naomi feel like she was being labeled, not as a legitimate passenger, but as a mistake that needed correcting. Richard Carter placed his hand on his wife's shoulder and nodded slightly. Lucas took off his headphones and let out a heavy sigh. "This is ridiculous," he said. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't look at Lucas. She looked out the window. Outside, the runway stretched out a pale gray under the cloudy sky. Other planes taxied, took off, and disappeared into the air. Life went on, even though here time seemed to stand still. Linda returned. She was accompanied by Captain Andrew Miller. The captain entered the cabin with a quick, decisive gait. He was in his 50s with short military-style hair and sharp eyes. He didn't look around. He stared straight at seat 1A. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Linda spoke softly and quickly, just loud enough for Captain Miller to hear. Naomi didn't hear everything, but she saw the way his eyes changed, from neutral to stern. Captain Miller stepped closer. "Miss," he said, his voice low, "I've been told that you're not cooperating with the flight crew." Naomi lifted her head. She looked at him, without avoiding his gaze. "I'm just sitting in my seat," she replied. Captain Miller looked down at the small table where the boarding pass was laid open. He glanced quickly. Then he looked back at Naomi. "We need to act quickly," he said. "This flight needs to get off." Evelyn Carter stood up straighter as if the captain's appearance confirmed her position. Naomi felt a wave of tension rising within her. These were no longer ambiguous glances. This was direct authority. She knew that from this moment on, every word could be interpreted as opposition. But she also knew that if she stood up now, no one in the compartment would remember the boarding pass. They would only remember that everything had been resolved. Naomi took a deep breath. Slowly. "I wasn't trying to delay the flight," she said. "But I can't leave this seat. This is my seat." Captain Miller looked at her. His gaze wasn't angry. But it was cold. "We'll talk more," he said. "But if you continue to disobey instructions, I'll be forced to take other measures." The first-class cabin fell silent again. Evelyn Carter smiled very faintly, a smile of someone who believed the scales had tipped in her favor. Naomi sat still. Her heart was pounding, but her back remained straight. And in that moment she understood that this was no longer about a seat. It was about the boundaries that others thought they had the right to cross. No one said anything for the next few seconds. The first-class cabin was enveloped in a thick silence as if the air had grown heavier. Naomi Brooks remained seated in seat 1A. Her back was straight. Her hands rested neatly on her lap. But inside, thoughts began to clash one after another. She could hear her heartbeat, regular, not erratic, but faster than usual. Captain Andrew Miller stood directly in front of her. His presence transformed the atmosphere. These were no longer fleeting glances or vague suggestions. This was official authority. The authority bestowed upon the man responsible for getting this plane airborne. "Miss Brooks," he repeated, his voice low and firm. "We are trying to resolve this situation amicably." Naomi nodded slightly. She didn't deny it. But she didn't agree either. "I understand," she said. "I want everything to go smoothly, too." Evelyn Carter let out a soft sigh behind Captain Miller. The sigh wasn't loud, but it carried the weariness of someone accustomed to having their way. "Then you should cooperate," she said. "Nobody here wants to make things difficult for you." Naomi turned her head and looked at Evelyn. Her gaze was calm yet profound. "I don't feel like I'm being treated fairly," Naomi said. "And I don't think standing up will make things any fairer." That statement wasn't meant to be provocative. It was simply the truth spoken frankly. Richard Carter frowned. Lucas Carter let out a weary, soft laugh. "Unbelievable," Lucas muttered. "Just a seat." Naomi heard it. She'd heard it countless times in her life. Just a question. Just a misunderstanding. Just a seat. Those words, it's just, that are always used to downplay other people's feelings. Naomi took a deep breath. She didn't answer Lucas. She turned to look at Captain Miller. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said, "but I can't leave this seat. This is my seat. I paid for it." Linda Hayes stood beside Captain Miller, her hand gripping the device tightly. She said nothing, but Naomi could clearly see the tension in her posture. Part of Linda probably understood that things were going too far. But another part, the one accustomed to handling difficult passengers, was prevailing. "Miss Brooks," Linda said, finally speaking up, "if you continue to disregard flight crew instructions, we will have to consider this a disruptive act." The word disruptive came down like a sharp cut. Naomi felt her chest tighten. She knew what that word meant on an airplane. It wasn't just a sticker. It was the gateway to much more serious consequences. Security, airport police, being asked to leave the plane. She looked around. Several passengers had started taking out their phones, whether checking messages or preparing to record something was unclear. Their gazes were no longer neutral. They carried a sense of impatience. Naomi understood. Nobody here hated her. But a lot of people wanted the problem to disappear. She wondered in her mind very quickly, what would happen if she stood up now? She will step out of seat 1A. She will walk toward the back, maybe to an economy seat. Maybe somewhere temporary. The flight will take off. Everyone will breathe a sigh of relief. Linda Hayes will make a note that problem solved. Captain Miller will continue her shift. And Naomi will carry with her a familiar feeling. A feeling that has been with her since childhood. The feeling of shrinking herself down to let everything flow peacefully. She remembered her father. Marcus Brooks never said his daughter had to confront every injustice. He didn't teach her to be a hero. But he always emphasized one thing: don't make yourself seem small just to make others feel comfortable. Naomi looked down at her hands. Her fingers were slightly cold. But they were still steady. I wasn't causing trouble, she said, her voice even. I was just defending my rights. Captain Miller looked at her. His gaze wavered for a very brief moment. Perhaps he was considering something. Perhaps he was thinking about the schedule, the delays, the procedures that had to be followed. But Evelyn Carter didn't let that moment last. Andrew, she said, calling him by his name affectionately. We can't let this go on. My son is standing here and everyone is waiting. The way she said everyone made Naomi feel like she was being separated from the group. Captain Miller turned to Evelyn, then looked back at Naomi. Miss Brooks, he said, I need your cooperation. Otherwise, I will be forced to call airport security. The threat wasn't spoken aloud, but it was clear. No explanation was needed. The first-class cabin seemed to hold its breath. Naomi felt a wave of heat rise to the back of her neck. Not anger. Rather something akin to a cold, sharp clarity. She realized that from this moment on, every choice had a price. She can get up and leave, the price of instant peace, or she could just sit back, the price of being seen as difficult. Naomi closed her eyes for a very brief second, just long enough to hear her father's voice again in her memory. You don't need to raise your voice to be respected, but you don't need to disappear either. She opened her eyes. May I ask, Naomi said, looking directly at Captain Miller, if another passenger dressed differently than me were sitting in this seat, would this have happened? The question fell into the compartment softly but sharply. No one answered immediately. Linda Hayes turned away as if avoiding that gaze. Evelyn Carter pursed her lips. Richard Carter coughed softly. Lucas Carter looked away. Captain Miller was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke. This isn't about that. Naomi nodded. She had already guessed the answer. But I think so, she said, not raising her voice, not accusing, just stating her opinion. That bluntness made the atmosphere even more tense. Captain Miller clenched his jaw. You're making things complicated, he said, and I don't have much time. Naomi felt a very slight sadness wash over her. Not because she was about to lose, but because she realized that in this moment the truth was no longer strong enough. She looked around again. Unfamiliar faces, people who didn't know who she was, who her father was, and they didn't need to know. To them, she was just a small obstacle on their way to London. Naomi inhaled, exhaled. I understand, she said, but I still won't get up. At that moment, everything seemed to stop. Captain Miller looked at her, her gaze colder than before. Evelyn Carter nodded slightly as if confirming what she expected. Linda Hayes straightened up, preparing for the next step. Naomi knew that from now on things could never go back to how they were. She didn't know if she would be asked to leave the plane. She didn't know when security would appear. But she knew this decision wasn't an impulsive act. It was the result of years of learning not to back down from her position. And whatever the outcome, Naomi knew she wouldn't have to carry the burden of regretting her silence. Outside the window, another plane had just taken off. The sound of the engines echoed, then faded away. Life went on. But for Naomi, this moment had become a dividing line between being at peace and being yourself. Captain Andrew Miller stood taller. His shoulders were square. His chin jutted forward. It was the posture of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. In the quiet first-class cabin, every small movement of his carried weight. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice low but firm, "I am giving one final instruction." Linda Hayes stood right beside him, her hands close to her sides, as if preparing for a familiar scenario. She didn't look at Naomi. She stared straight ahead at the aisle leading to the airplane door. Her gaze made it clear things had gone too far to turn back. Naomi lifted her head. She looked at Captain Miller, no averting her gaze. No challenge, just looking. "I'm listening," she said. A few passengers in the back began to shift. There was a very faint creaking of the seats. A man coughed softly. These small sounds were more noticeable than usual because everyone in the compartment was holding their breath. Captain Miller lowered his voice slightly, but that didn't diminish its firmness. "We have a responsibility to ensure order and safety on this flight," he said. "If a passenger does not follow the flight crew's instructions, we have the right to ask that person to leave the aircraft." Naomi heard every word clearly. She knew it. She had read the regulations. She understood the captain's authority. But she also understood something else. Authority doesn't equate to correctness. "I wasn't causing a disturbance," Naomi said. "I wasn't making noise. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just sitting in the seat that was on my ticket." Linda Hayes turned to look at her for the first time in a few minutes. Her gaze wasn't angry, but there was something cold about it, as if Naomi had crossed an invisible boundary. "Miss Brooks," Linda said, "you need to understand that failing to follow the captain's instructions is a serious violation." Naomi nodded. "I understand," she replied, "but I don't understand why the instructions require me to leave my seat." A brief silence, very brief, but enough for Evelyn Carter to interject. "We're going in circles," she said, her voice laced with feigned patience. "The issue is simple. My son needs to sit here, and this girl can sit somewhere else." The way she referred to herself as "this little girl" made Naomi feel like she was shrinking, becoming an anonymous object, nameless, historyless, backgroundless. Richard Carter stood beside his wife, nodding slightly. Lucas Carter folded his arms, his gaze fixed on the window as if all of this were just a minor annoyance. "Captain Miller Quay," sang Evelyn. "Madam," he said, "we are processing it." Then he turned back to Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he continued, "if you don't get up right now, I'll call airport security." The word security rang out sharp and clear. The first-class cabin seemed to shrink. A few people looked down at their phones. One woman closed her eyes as if she didn't want to see what was happening next. No one protested. No one asked a question. Naomi felt her stomach tighten, not from vague fear, but because she knew exactly what might happen next. Familiar images flashed through her mind, not from personal experience, but from stories she had heard and read. She knew that just one wrong step could lead to this situation being interpreted in a completely different way. She inhaled. She exhaled. "Can I ask a question?" Naomi said. Captain Miller frowned. "You can ask quickly," he replied. "If you stand up and leave this seat," Naomi said, her voice even, "who will be responsible for you being asked to leave a seat you paid for?" The question wasn't challenging. It was logical. But in this context, logic doesn't seem to be the priority. Linda Hayes shook her head slightly. "We're not talking about financial responsibility here," she said. "We're talking about following instructions." Naomi nodded. She understood. The issue was no longer about tickets, no longer about seats. It was about who had the authority to give orders and who had to obey. Evelyn Carter smiled very slightly. A smile of someone who believes everything is going in the right direction. "Andrew," she said, calling Captain Miller by his name, "we can't let this escalate. I think this girl is just confused." Naomi turned to look at her. "I'm not confused," Naomi said. "I'm perfectly clear." That clarity added another layer of tension to the atmosphere. Captain Miller clenched his jaw. He turned to Linda. "Note this situation," he said. "Prepare to contact security." Linda nodded. She pulled out her communication device, her fingers gliding quickly across the screen. The movement was decisive, familiar, as if she had done this countless times before. Naomi looked down at her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly, very slightly. She pressed them against her thighs tightly together to maintain her composure. She didn't want anyone to see the tremor. She thought of her father. Marcus Brooks once told her about a meeting many years ago when he was the youngest person in the room. One of the partners had said, half jokingly, half seriously, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Marcus didn't get angry. He didn't leave. He simply replied, "If I weren't in the right place, this room wouldn't exist. Naomi didn't have such a sharp answer. She didn't have the power of a CEO, she only had the truth, and herself. She looked at Captain Miller again. I don't want to make things worse, Naomi said, but I can't leave this seat. If you need to call security, I'll sit here and wait. The words rang out softly but firmly. The first-class cabin fell into complete silence. Evelyn Carter paused for a very brief moment, not because she didn't believe Naomi, but because she hadn't expected the girl to be so unwavering. Richard Carter frowned. Lucas Carter turned his head, looking more closely at Naomi. For the first time, his gaze wasn't just one of annoyance. It was mixed with something akin to surprise. Linda Hayes stopped what she was doing. She looked up at Naomi. Her eyes were no longer cold. They held a fleeting moment of hesitation. But only a moment. Then she turned away. Captain Miller let out a heavy sigh. Okay, he said. We'll follow the procedure. He turned his back and walked towards the front of the cabin where there was an internal telephone that led outside the plane. Linda followed him. Their footsteps echoed more clearly than ever before. Naomi sat still. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear her own breath. She could hear the sound of other planes taxiing outside. She didn't know when the security would arrive. She didn't know what they would say. She didn't know how this would end. But she knew one thing: from this moment on, power was used to coerce, not to protect, and that whatever the outcome crossed the line from a mere misunderstanding. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. She closed her eyes for a very brief second, just long enough to catch her breath. Then she opened her eyes and looked straight ahead. Somewhere outside the aircraft, a low hum echoed. The engines were preparing. The flight hadn't yet taken off. But this story had entered a new phase. A phase where silence no longer protected anyone. After Captain Andrew Miller turned his back and walked forward in the compartment, a strange, empty space was left behind him. Nobody said anything. It wasn't the gentle silence before takeoff. It was a heavy silence, as if every sound was trapped somewhere in each person's chest. Naomi Brooks, sitting in seat 1A, felt it acutely. The atmosphere was no longer neutral. It was tense and suffocating. Linda Hayes stood beside the intercom, her back to Naomi. She was waiting for a signal, waiting for the next step in a process she believed she was following correctly. The Carter family stood behind her, unusually silent. Evelyn Carter said nothing more. She just stood there, her gaze fixed ahead as if everything was already on track. Richard Carter glanced around the compartment, then checked his watch. Lucas Carter leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He no longer seemed impatient. On the contrary, he looked like someone watching an outcome that had already been predicted. Naomi realized that, and it was that very calmness that weighed heavily on her heart. She looked down at the small table in front of her. The boarding pass was still there. A thin piece of paper, but full of information. Her name, seat number, destination. It was proof. But in this moment, that proof seemed insufficient. Naomi felt her throat dry up. She swallowed hard. Then she took a deep breath, trying to keep her breathing steady. She didn't want anyone to see her wavering, not because she was embarrassed, but because she understood that wavering was often misinterpreted as wrong. She thought about the people around her. The other passengers in first class were witnessing it all. They didn't know her story. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she had been through to get here. To them, Naomi was just a situation, a minor incident causing a delay. A man in the opposite seat shook his head slightly. It was unclear whether it was out of annoyance or discomfort with the whole situation. Another woman frowned, then turned away as if looking directly at Naomi made her uncomfortable. Naomi understands that feeling. When faced with injustice, many people choose to look away, not because they agree with it, but because they don't want to get involved. Their silence wasn't deliberate complicity, but it had a similar effect. Naomi wondered in that moment, if she were to stand up and leave, would anyone in this cabin remember what had just happened, or would everything simply vanish the moment the plane started moving? She recalled an evening a few years ago. She and her father sat in their car, parked on the side of the road, waiting for another car to pass. On the radio was a news report about a controversial incident. A black man had been asked to leave a public space for disrupting the peace, even though he was simply sitting still. Naomi asked her father, "Why is no one saying anything?" Marcus Brooks remained silent for a long time before answering. "Because many people are afraid," he said. "Afraid that if they speak out, they will become the next part of the story." Now Naomi understands that very well. She looked up and saw Linda Hayes pick up the internal phone. She said something very briefly in a low, professional voice. Naomi couldn't hear every word clearly, but she understood the gist. Security, procedure, uncooperative passenger. Those words don't describe people. They describe a problem. Linda put the phone down. Then she turned to look at Naomi. "Miss Brooks," she said, "airport security is on their way." The statement was made calmly. No threats, no anger, as if it were just the next step on a to-do list. Naomi nodded. "I understand," she said. She heard Evelyn Carter let out a soft sigh, a quiet sigh, almost one of satisfaction. Richard Carter straightened up. Lucas Carter narrowed his eyes, looking at Naomi as if trying to figure out what she would do next. The first-class cabin fell silent again. Naomi felt her hands begin to grow cold. She pressed them together gently, squeezing to keep them warm. She wasn't afraid of the security, but she was afraid of how this story might be retold. Afraid that though the truth was simple, it would be distorted into something else. She looked around again. No one spoke. No one said, "She has a valid ticket." No one asked why her. That silence wasn't a scream, but it was loud enough to drown. Naomi closed her eyes for a very brief moment. She wasn't praying. She was simply reminding herself to stay calm, to speak clearly, to not let her emotions control her words. She opened her eyes just as Captain Miller returned. He quickened his pace. His face was no longer neutral. It was tense and somewhat irritated. He looked at Naomi, then at Linda, then glanced towards the airplane door. "Security is on its way," Linda said, confirming. Captain Miller nodded. "Okay," he said. "We'll settle this once and for all." He turned to Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I need your cooperation to prevent things from getting worse." Naomi lifted her head. Her eyes were calm yet deep. She cooperated, she said. She sat still. She spoke clearly. She didn't make any noise. Captain Miller let out a heavy sigh. "The child is refusing to leave the seat as instructed," he replied. "That's enough for us to consider this a violation of regulations." Naomi nodded. "Then I'll wait for security," she said. "But I won't get up and leave on my own." The words rang out, not in a loud voice, but firmly. It wasn't a challenge. It was a declaration. Evelyn Carter raised an eyebrow. A fleeting look of surprise crossed her face, then vanished just as quickly. She turned to Richard and whispered something. Richard didn't reply, only nodded. Lucas Carter shook his head and chuckled softly. "That's crazy," he murmured. Naomi heard it. She didn't react. She stared straight ahead, as if everything around her had blurred, leaving only a fixed point. She knew that from this moment on, the story no longer belonged to her. It had slipped out of her personal control. It was being driven by process, by power, by unspoken assumptions. Outside, on the other side of the airplane door, Naomi heard footsteps. She couldn't tell whose, but they were clear enough to draw everyone's attention. Linda Hayes turned around. Captain Miller straightened up. The Carter family looked up. Naomi felt her heart pounding faster, not from panic, but because she knew the next moment would decide everything. She quickly wondered, if security came in, what would I say first? She would say she had a ticket, that she wasn't causing trouble, that she was just sitting quietly. She would tell the truth. But she also knew that the truth isn't always the first thing to hear. Naomi inhaled, exhaled. She didn't know whose side the security forces would take, but she knew she wouldn't retreat in silence. The footsteps outside are clearer, closer. The first-class cabin seemed to freeze over. And in that moment, Naomi Brooks understood that this was the first climax of the story. Not when everything explodes, but when everyone waits to see if a young person will break down. Naomi did not bow her head. She remained seated in seat 1A. Wait. The sound of footsteps outside the airplane door stopped. Not hurried footsteps, but a deliberate pause. As if someone were standing just outside, quickly reading a list, listening to a summary, preparing to enter a space already as tense as a tightrope, Naomi Brooks sat still in seat 1A. She didn't turn her head. She looked straight ahead where the partition between the first-class cabin and the cockpit reflected the soft light. In that light, her face appeared so calm it was almost alien to her own self. Inside, Naomi's confidence is being stretched to its limit. It wasn't the belief that she was right. She never doubted that. Rather, it was the belief that standing firm would be rewarded with justice. She heard a faint metallic sound against the door. Then the door opened. 2 airport security officers entered. They wore neat dark uniforms. Neither appeared aggressive, neither seemed hurried. They walked slowly, their eyes scanning the cabin quickly, as if reading the atmosphere before reading the people. Captain Andrew Miller took a step forward. "Thank you for arriving quickly," he said. "We had a passenger who didn't follow instructions." The statement was concise. It lacked emotion and context. Naomi felt a pang in her chest. She knew that from this moment on how the story was told would determine so much. One of the two security officers nodded. He looked around the compartment, then his gaze settled on Naomi. "Miss," he said, his voice neutral. "Can we speak to you?" Naomi looked up. Her eyes met the security guard's. She didn't look away. "Yes," she replied. "Right here is fine, too." The security guard paused briefly. A very slight reaction. Then he nodded. "Can you tell us what's going on?" he asked. Captain Miller opened his mouth, but Naomi spoke first. "I was sitting in the seat, indicated on my ticket," she said slowly, "and I was asked to leave my seat to make room for another passenger. I refused." The way she spoke didn't carry anger, no blame, just a presentation. The security guard looked down at the small table in front of Naomi. The boarding pass was still there. He bent down and read it quickly. "Naomi Brooks," he read, "Seat 1A. He looked up and met Captain Miller's gaze. "The ticket is valid," he said. Linda Hayes took a step forward. "The problem isn't the ticket," she said. "The problem is that this passenger didn't follow the flight crew's instructions." The security guard turned to look at Naomi. "Are you refusing any other instructions?" he asked. Naomi shook her head. She wasn't making noise, she said. She wasn't standing up. She wasn't blocking the aisle. She just wasn't leaving her seat. A brief silence. Evelyn Carter cleared her throat. "We tried to explain," she said. "My son needs to sit with his family. And this girl is slowing down the flight." The security guard looked at her. Then at Lucas Carter. Then at Naomi. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "Does he have a ticket for this compartment?" Evelyn paused. Just for a moment. Then she replied, "No. But we are long-time customers." The security guard nodded. No reaction. He turned back to Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we need to ensure the flight is safe and on time. If you continue to disregard the flight crew's instructions, we may ask you to leave the aircraft." Naomi heard every word clearly. She knew this was the crucial point. She could get up, follow them outside, and deal with it later. Or she could sit back and let things escalate further. Her belief was stirred. It wasn't because she was afraid. It was because she was beginning to wonder, would standing firm here really change anything? She looked around the compartment. Unfamiliar faces, avoidant glances. No one spoke up in support. No one openly opposed. The silence returned. Thick and heavy. Naomi felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. Not physical exhaustion, but exhaustion from always having to be the one to maintain the boundaries. She remembered a morning not so long ago. Marcus Brooks stood in the kitchen making coffee. Naomi leaned against the counter, telling him about a meeting where her opinion was ignored until someone else repeated the exact same thing. "Do you feel like you've gotten smaller?" Marcus asked. Naomi nodded. "So next time," he said, "you can choose to speak up again. Or you can choose to remain silent. Neither choice is wrong. Just know why you chose it." Now, Naomi is facing that very question. The security officer waited. He didn't pressure them, but the wait carried a sense of pressure. Captain Miller stood with his arms crossed. Linda Hayes looked down at the floor. The Carter family was silent, as if they were certain of the outcome. Naomi inhaled, exhaled. "Can I call my guardian?" she asked. That question made everyone pause. Captain Miller frowned. "How old are you?" he asked. 17, Naomi replied. The security guards exchanged glances for a second. Then the one standing near Naomi nodded. "You have the right to call," he said. Evelyn Carter chuckled softly. "That's unnecessary," she said. "We're dealing with a very simple matter." Naomi didn't look at her. She bent down, opened her handbag, and took out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held on tight. The screen lit up. The contacts appeared. She paused for a second. Her faith was stirred once again. But this time it wasn't a vague belief. It was a very concrete belief. About a person. About a voice. Naomi clicked on Marcus Brooks' name. The phone vibrated. Once, then twice. In the first-class cabin, everyone waited. No one spoke, but all eyes were on Naomi. She held the phone to her ear. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I'm on a plane. I need you." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus's voice came through. Deep. Steady. "Go ahead and speak," he said. Naomi closed her eyes for a very brief moment. She wasn't complaining. She was just telling the truth. They wanted my child to get out of his seat, she said, and they called security. The first-class cabin was eerily silent. Captain Miller took a step forward as if to end the call. The security officer raised his hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Marcus's voice on the other end of the line changed. Not loud, but colder. "Which seat are you in?" he asked. "One," Naomi replied. "Do you have a ticket?" "Have." "Did you cause any trouble?" "Or not?" There was a very brief silence. Then Marcus spoke. "Stay right there." 2 words. Not raised, not commanding, but as firm as a rock. Naomi opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead. She didn't know what would happen next. But her faith, though shaken, was anchored. Marcus Brooks said nothing more. But that was enough. She put the phone down. She looked at Captain Miller. She looked at Linda Hayes. She looked at the 2 security officers. "My dad wants to speak to the person in charge," Naomi said. At that moment, the scales in the first-class cabin began to shift, very slowly, but irreversibly. Naomi's faith, which had just been tested to the point of shattering, is now held together by a thin thread. But strong enough. The first-class cabin remained silent as Naomi Brooks put down her phone. It wasn't the tense silence of before. Instead, it was a new kind of waiting. Waiting to see who would be the one to answer. Naomi held the phone in her hand, the screen still lit. Marcus Brooks's name was clearly visible. She didn't raise it. No need. She simply sat still, back straight, her gaze calm, as if everything from this moment on had transcended simple explanation. Captain Andrew Miller glanced quickly at the 2 security officers. Then he looked at Naomi. "Miss Brooks," he said, "you're disrupting the process." Naomi lifted her head. "I'm just calling my guardian," she replied, "as I'm entitled to." The security guard standing closest to her nodded very slightly. It was a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but Naomi saw it, and she understood that at least here the truth still had a place. Linda Hayes stepped forward. "We need to resolve this quickly," she said, her voice low. "The flight is delayed." Naomi didn't answer. She looked at Linda, then turned to Captain Miller. "My dad wants to speak to the highest-ranking person here," she said. "Right now." Evelyn Carter chuckled softly, a short, confident laugh. "It's really unnecessary," she said. "We're making a big deal out of it." Naomi turned her head, looking directly at Evelyn Carter for the first time, for a longer than a beat. "For me," Naomi said, her voice still even, "this is no small matter." The first-class cabin felt like it was frozen solid. Captain Miller took a deep breath, then exhaled. He turned to Linda. "Give me the phone," he said. Linda paused. Very slightly, but then she reached out. Naomi handed the phone to Captain Miller. His hand touched the receiver firmly and quickly. He held the phone to his ear. "This is Captain Miller," he said. "I am the captain of Flight NW482. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Marcus Brooks's voice came through. Not loud, not harsh, but it carried a terrifying calmness. "Hello," Captain Marcus said. "I heard my daughter is having trouble with her seat." Captain Miller straightened up. By reflex. "There was a passenger who did not follow instructions," he said. "We are handling it according to procedure." "My daughter," Marcus said, interrupting slightly. "Which seat is she sitting in?" "Seat 1, Captain Miller replied. "And is that seat number on her ticket?" "Yes," Captain Miller said after a pause. "So," Marcus said, his voice lowering slightly. "Why was she asked to leave her seat?" The question fell into the compartment like a heavy weight. No one said anything. Captain Miller clenched his jaw. "We need to maintain order," he said. "And there's a family that's requesting." Marcus didn't raise his voice, but he interrupted. "Are you talking about order?" Marcus said. "Or are you talking about the convenience for another passenger?" Captain Miller didn't answer immediately. Inside the compartment, Evelyn Carter began to sense that something was wrong. She looked at Linda. Linda avoided her gaze. Marcus continued. "My daughter is 17, he said. "She's not causing trouble. She's not standing up. She's not shouting. She just won't leave her rightful seat." "Right," Captain Miller swallowed hard. "Yes," he said. So Marcus said, his voice still even. "You're using your authority to force a child out of their seat, simply because another passenger wants them. Do you understand what that looks like?" The first-class cabin was eerily silent. The security guards exchanged glances. Linda Hayes stood motionless. The Carter family said nothing. Lucas Carter took off his headphones, his eyes beginning to waver. Captain Miller opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't find a suitable answer. "Are you documenting this?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Captain Miller replied. "Good," Marcus said. "Then I want you to state clearly my daughter has a valid ticket. She hasn't violated any rules. And the request for her to leave her seat was a subjective decision." Captain Miller closed his eyes for a very brief second. Then he opened them. "Who are you?" he asked. Marcus was silent for a moment. Then he spoke. "I'm Marcus Brooks," he said, CEO of Northway Airlines. At that moment, the atmosphere in the cabin changed completely. Linda Hayes froze, her face turned pale. One of the security guards subtly furrowed his brow, then his eyes widened. Evelyn Carter stood motionless, her smile vanishing. Richard Carter turned to look at his wife as if realizing for the first time that something was slipping from their grasp. Captain Miller stood motionless. "Excuse me," he said, his voice much lower. "I am Marcus Brooks," Marcus repeated, "and I want to know why my staff are threatening to call security to remove my daughter from the plane." A long silence. Nobody said anything. Naomi sat still. She stared straight ahead. Her heart pounded faster, but not wildly. She didn't feel victorious. She only felt a very slight sadness. Because she knew that if she weren't Marcus Brooks's daughter, things might have ended very differently. Captain Miller cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks," he said, I haven't been given all the information yet." "You have enough information to threaten a child," Marcus replied, "but not enough information to protect it." Linda Hayes' hands trembled. She took a step forward, her voice faltering. "Mr. Brooks," she said, we're just following procedure." Marcus let out a slow breath. "Processes don't exist to shield against prejudice," he said. "They exist to protect people." He paused for a moment. "I'm on my way to JFK," Marcus said. "But before I get there, I want all coercive actions to stop immediately." Captain Miller nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." And Marcus added, "I want to speak to the ground crew. Right now." The security guard standing closest to Naomi extended his hand. "We'll get in touch," he said. Marcus ended the call with a short sentence. "Naomi," he said, "are you all right?" "Yes," Naomi replied. "I'm fine." "You're doing great," Marcus said. "Just sit still. I'll take care of the rest. The call has ended." Captain Miller lowered the phone. His hand was no longer as steady as before. Linda Hayes stood silently, her eyes vacant. The Carter family said nothing. Evelyn Carter took a step back as if the ground beneath her feet had just shifted. The first-class cabin was no longer silent because of tension. It was silent because of awareness. Naomi sat in seat 1A. No one asked her to stand up anymore. No one said another word. Out there on the runway, a service vehicle drives by. Time continues to pass, but the situation has changed. And in that moment, Naomi Brooks understood that this call had not only changed her position on the plane, it had just exposed a truth that everyone knew, but rarely had to face. After the call ended, the first-class cabin was no longer the same. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed it. The atmosphere had changed. The lighting was still soft. The carpets were still thick. The scent of warm towels still lingered. But the invisible force that had once enveloped the cabin, the confidence of those who thought everything would go their way, had cracked. Captain Andrew Miller stood still for a few seconds. He looked down at the phone he had just lowered from his ear as if it were heavier than usual. Then he looked up, his eyes, no longer cold. They had become cautious, calculating. "Linda," he said, his voice low, "suspend all procedures related to this passenger." Linda Hayes nodded immediately. Her movements were quicker than before, a reflex as power shifted. She turned to the two security officers. "Thank you," Linda said. "We'll take over from here." The security officer looked at Naomi, then at Captain Miller. He nodded slightly. "If you need any further assistance, please feel free to call," he said. The two men turned their backs and walked out of the compartment. Their footsteps faded into the distance, leaving behind another silence no longer heavy as before, but a silence as everyone rearranged their positions in the story. Naomi Brooks remained seated in seat 1A. She didn't move. She didn't sigh. She didn't smile. She just sat still, her hands resting neatly on her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. In that moment, she didn't feel victorious. She felt clear-headed. She understood that from this point on, things would happen very quickly. Captain Miller turned to the Carter family. "Mr. and Mrs.," he said, his voice different now. "I apologize for the inconvenience. We will consider other options for your son's seat." Evelyn Carter opened her mouth, then closed it. A rare pause. She looked at Linda as if waiting for confirmation. Linda avoided her gaze. We are long-time customers, Evelyn said, her voice lower than before. I didn't think. Captain Miller raised his hand slightly. I understand, he said, but we have to follow the rules. Rules. That word was just used to force Naomi out of her seat. Now it's being used to keep her there. Lucas Carter looked around the compartment. He noticed a change in the way the others looked at him. No one was looking at Naomi as a problem anymore. A few glances shifted to the Carter family, not overtly judgmental, but enough to make him feel out of place. Richard Carter cleared his throat. So, where will this lead? He asked. Officer Miller looked at him. We'll handle this after the flight takes off, he said. For now, please return to your seats. Evelyn Carter stood still for a second. Then she turned and walked toward seat 2A. Gone was her usual slow, confident stride. Each step felt somewhat awkward. Lucas followed, pulling his suitcase. As he passed Naomi, he paused very slightly. He said nothing. He just looked. For the first time, his gaze lacked contempt. It was something akin to confusion. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Linda Hayes turned towards Naomi. Miss Brooks, she said, her voice lowered. Do you need water? Or anything else? Naomi shook her head. I'm fine, she said. Linda nodded, then took a step back. She stood there as if unsure what to do next. Her professional confidence, which had once been so strong, was being replaced by a newfound caution. Captain Miller stepped forward in the compartment, speaking briefly into the radio. Naomi couldn't hear the content clearly, but she noticed how he stood, how he chose his words. Everything slowed down, more cautiously. First class returned to its normal rhythm. Passengers adjusted their seats, opened their laptops, put on their headphones. But one thing hadn't gone back to how it was: the way people looked at Naomi. A woman in the opposite seat looked over, her gaze softening. A man nodded slightly when their eyes met, not to apologize, not to praise, just a small acknowledgement. Naomi realized that, and it calmed her down. She thought of her father's words. Standing firm doesn't always change the world immediately, but it slows the world down long enough for its true colors to be revealed. The loudspeaker blared. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Miller said, his voice now calm, we apologize for the delay. The flight will resume its preparation for takeoff in a few minutes. Naomi looked out the window. Outside, the runway stretched out. The sky was a pale gray. New York City was still bustling in the distance, as if unaware of the minor confrontation that had just taken place in first class. She thought about what had just happened, about how a single phone call had turned everything around, and about the lingering, heavy feeling. She didn't like needing her father's authority to be treated fairly. She wasn't proud of it, but she wasn't ashamed either, because she knew the issue wasn't who she called. The issue was how far things would have gone if she hadn't called. Linda Hayes turned around and placed a small bottle of water on the table in front of Naomi. If you need anything else, she said, please just let me know. Naomi nodded very slightly. Thank you. 2 words. Enough. No more. Linda turned away. Her steps slowed as if each step was carefully considered. In seat 2A, Evelyn Carter sat silently. She said nothing. Richard Carter looked down at his phone. Lucas Carter put his headphones back on, but didn't turn on any music. He stared intently at the black screen. No one said it out loud. But the Carter family understood that their position had changed. The engines began to hum deep and steady. The plane vibrated slightly. The backtracking procedure began. A familiar rhythm, but today it carried a different undertone. Naomi placed her hand on the armrest of the chair. She felt the vibrations spread through her body. She exhaled slowly. She didn't feel completely relieved. She felt something like clarity. It is clear that without intervention from someone at the highest level, the truth would not have been sufficient. It is clear that power can distort the process and then correct it depending on who is being affected. And clearly this moment doesn't end here. The plane taxied. The city gradually receded into the distance. Naomi looked out the window, seeing the buildings shrink, then turn into blurry masses. She knew that when the wheels left the ground, a new chapter would begin. Not just for the flight, but for those who had just witnessed the reversal of power right before their eyes. And somewhere in internal notes and unwritten reports, the wheels of consequences have already begun to turn. As the wheels of Flight NW482 lifted off the ground, Naomi Brooks had no idea that below things had just begun. In the first-class cabin, the lighting was softer. The engine sounds were steady and low. Those around gradually retreated to their own worlds, headphones, screens, unsent emails. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But elsewhere, not far away, the heartbeat of an entire system was accelerating. At Northway Airlines Operations Center in JFK, a large screen mounted on the wall displayed a list of active flights. NW482 appeared with a small annotation, an internal note that had just been pushed up following a call from Marcus Brooks. Sarah Linwood, Director of Ground Operations for the Northeast region, stood at the control panel. She had worked in the airline industry for over 20 years. She was used to incidents, used to complaints. But this note made her pause longer than usual. "What's going on?" a young manager asked, leaning over to look at the screen. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She played the recording of the call that had just been sent to her. Marcus Brooks's voice rang out deep, slow, and clear. There was no outburst of anger, only the cold precision of someone who had seen the problem all too many times. When the recording ended, Sarah let out a long sigh. "Call an emergency meeting," she said. "Right now." In the small conference room behind the operations center, the door closed. The chairs quickly filled. Human resources representatives, flight safety, legal, customer service. Each person carried a file. No one spoke much. Everyone understood the seriousness of the situation when the CEO personally called from the scene. Sarah started the meeting. "We're not talking about a seat incident," she said. "We're talking about how power is used and abused on our own aircraft." She pressed the remote control. A snippet of the report appeared on the screen. Linda Hayes' name, Captain Andrew Miller's name, the Carter family name, and a note that silenced the room. "The passenger is a minor. The ticket is valid. They are being asked to leave their seat to make room for another passenger." "Do we have any precedent for this?" someone asked. Sarah nodded. "Yes," she said, "and that's the problem." She turned to the next page, a short but weighty list past complaints concerning Linda Hayes. Not many. Not enough for severe disciplinary action, but enough to form a pattern of behavior. "And what about Captain Miller?" the security officer asked. Sarah looked down at another file. "Their flying skills are good," she said, "but there are notes about their conflict resolution. Rigid, prioritizing speed over people." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. At the other end of the city, Marcus Brooks strode quickly through the glass lobby of Northway Airlines headquarters. He wasn't accompanied by many people. Not necessary. His face was calm, but his eyes were focused, as if everything had been arranged in his mind. "What do we have?" he asked, as he entered the meeting room. Sarah stood up. "The transcript, the initial report, and the list of people involved," she replied. Marcus sat down. He didn't look at the screen right away. He looked at the people in the room. "What concerns me," he said, "is not who did what in the last 10 minutes, but why it happened." No one answered immediately. Marcus Quay sang Sarah. "My daughter isn't the first," he said. "And if we treat this as just an exception, it won't be the last." Sarah nodded. "We are recommending a temporary suspension pending an investigation," she said. "Both Linda Hayes and Captain Miller." Marcus didn't nod immediately. He thought for a moment. "Suspension is just the first step," he said. "But I want something else as well." He looked around the room. "I want the entire cabin camera recording. All flights over the last 6 months where Linda Hayes was involved in conflict resolution. I want to see how decisions were made when no one had the authority to make the call." The room fell silent. Then a few people nodded. "And the Carter family?" someone asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "They're not the focus," he said. "They're the catalyst. If it wasn't them, it would be someone else." He paused for a moment. "But if there is evidence of coercion, we will handle it according to customer ethics guidelines." At an altitude of over 30,000 feet, Naomi Brooks was unaware of the meetings taking place. She sat leaning back, staring at the screen, which was off. She wasn't watching a movie. She wasn't listening to music. She was just letting her thoughts drift slowly. A part of her was still trembling, not from fear, but from the aftershocks. Only when the tension subsided did her body allow itself to feel. She thought about the moment Captain Miller picked up the phone, about Linda Hayes' expression when she heard her father's name, about the sudden change in how everyone was behaving. It made her sad. It wasn't because they feared her father. It was because they weren't afraid of injustice until injustice touched real power. Another flight attendant, not Linda, walked by. She was young, with a reserved but kind gaze. "Do you need anything?" she asked. Naomi shook her head. "I'm fine," Naomi replied. "Thank you." The flight attendant smiled and continued on her way. It was a very small interaction, but Naomi felt it was real. She opened her phone. A message from Marcus appeared. "Dad is handling it. You rest." Naomi typed back very briefly. "I'm fine. I just want this not to happen to anyone else." 3 dots appeared, then a reply message. "That's why Dad is here." Naomi put the phone down. She closed her eyes. For the first time since boarding the plane, her shoulders relaxed. On the ground, the wheels of the production line continue to turn. Internal emails are sent out. Interviews are scheduled. The legal department reviews the wording. The HR department prepares the procedures. There is no press release. Not yet. Marcus Brooks stood by the conference room window, looking down at the stream of cars below. He knew the real storm would come when the story leaked out. But before that happened, he wanted his house cleaned from the inside. "We're not looking for a scapegoat," he said, turning around. "We're looking for the truth, and we're going to fix it." Sarah nodded. "Yes, sir." On flight NW482, the seatbelt sign came on. Naomi opened her eyes. She looked out the window. White clouds stretched out soft and thick. Sunlight shone on the airplane wings, sparkling. It was strangely peaceful outside. Little did she know that this very peace behind closed doors was being paid for with difficult decisions being made beneath the surface. And so her story, though unpublished, has begun to shake a seemingly stable order. Naomi Brooks was asleep when the plane crossed the Atlantic Ocean. It wasn't deep sleep, just a drowsy state where the sound of the engine became a steady background rhythm and thoughts dissolved like clouds outside the window. She dreamed of long corridors, white lights, and voices, saying the same sentence in different ways. It's just the procedure. She woke up as the cabin lights dimmed. Another flight attendant gently placed a blanket over her shoulders. Naomi opened her eyes and nodded in thanks. She looked around. First class was quiet. The Carter family wasn't speaking. They sat in their own world, silent and withdrawn. Naomi didn't know that while she slept, the story had left the airplane cabin. It started with a short text message. In the back seat, a passenger recorded the final seconds of the event. Naomi's face is unclear. The full dialogue is also missing. All that's captured is Captain Andrew Miller standing with his phone, his expression changing, and a whispered sentence picked up by the cabin microphone. CEO. Brooks. The video had no title. It was only sent to a small group chat, then to another group, then to an acquaintance who works in journalism. In New York, as the clock struck nearly midnight, a news editor opened her phone. She watched the video, then watched it again. Then she called a familiar source in the airline industry. "Is anything wrong on flight NW482?" she asked. The other source fell silent for a moment. "There hasn't been an announcement yet," the person said. "But there is." At Northway Airlines headquarters, the communications room was still brightly lit. Marcus Brooks stood in front of the glass, whiteboard arms crossed, listening to Sarah Linwood's report. "There's video," Sarah said. "It hasn't spread yet, but it will." Marcus nodded. He had predicted this. "We're not blocking," he said. "We're preparing." "A press release?" Sarah asked. "Not yet," Marcus replied. "We need the complete truth before we say anything." Sarah nodded. She understood. One wrong word at this moment could ruin everything they were trying to fix. On the other side of the city, a freelance journalist posted a tweet. "I heard there was an incident on a Northway flight involving discrimination in first class. It's being verified." The tweet didn't have many words, but it touched a familiar nerve. The answers began to emerge. Again, how many times has it happened? It's always the same story. Naomi was fully awake when the flight attendant offered her a snack. She shook her head. Not hungry. She opened her phone. The screen lit up with more notifications than usual. Messages from friends, from someone she knew at school, and a message from her father. "Don't read social media right now." Naomi understood immediately. She didn't open Twitter, but she opened her browser, typed in the flight name. No official news article, only fragmented pieces of information, a blurry video, a few lines of speculation. She put the phone down. She knew this feeling. The feeling when her story no longer belonged to her. In London, the sun was beginning to rise. On the flight, people were gradually waking up. A few passengers looked at Naomi longer than usual, not obviously, but enough for her to notice. A middle-aged man in the opposite seat leaned forward. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. Naomi nodded. "Yes," she replied. He didn't ask any further questions. He just nodded in return. A small gesture, but Naomi sensed its sincerity. In seat 2A, Evelyn Carter looked out the window. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't talking. Richard Carter was constantly checking his email. Lucas Carter looked at the screen but wasn't looking at anything. They also saw the announcement. They also understood that this story wouldn't end with the flight. At Northway Airlines, the second meeting of the night began. "We need to get ready for tomorrow morning," Sarah said. "The press will be calling." Marcus nodded. "They have the right," he said. "And we have the responsibility." He turned to the head of Human Resources. "What is the progress of the investigation? Linda Hayes has been temporarily suspended," the person replied. "Captain Miller is being asked to submit a detailed report." Marcus showed no emotion. "And the Carter family?" "We're reviewing the customer ethics clause," Sarah said. "No action has been taken yet." Marcus pondered. "We don't punish because of public pressure," he said. "We punish when we have evidence." A moment of silence. "But we don't condone wrongdoing either," he added. Sarah took notes. She knew the line was very thin. As the plane began to descend, Naomi felt a change in pressure. She looked out the window. The clouds dispersed. The ground came into view. The phone vibrated. A message from Marcus. "The press has started asking questions. I don't need to say anything. I don't owe them any answers." Naomi typed it back. "I'm just afraid the story will be distorted," Marcus answered quickly. "That's why Dad needed to speak at the right time." Naomi put the phone down. She closed her eyes for a few seconds. She thought about people like herself. No CEO fathers, no life-changing calls. She thought about other flights, other cabins, unrecorded stories. The loudspeaker blared. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into London Heathrow." The airplane cabin became busier. People adjusted their seats. They tidied up their belongings. Naomi fastened her seatbelt. She looked ahead where the flight path was displayed on the screen. Little did she know that at that very moment, a major news outlet was preparing to publish the article. The title temporarily appears on the editor's screen. "Teen passenger allegedly pressured to give up first-class seat on Northway flight." The editor paused. "Correct. One word. Teen passenger pressured to give up first-class seat on Northway flight." No longer allegedly. As the wheels touched the Heathrow runway, Naomi felt a slight tremor. The plane slowed down. One chapter ended. But another, much larger one, opened. In New York, Marcus Brooks looked at his computer screen. He saw the headline. He exhaled slowly. "It's time," he said. He turned to Sarah. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll talk. No blaming. No avoidance." Sarah nodded. "And Naomi?" she asked. Marcus looked out the window. "She'll decide," he said. "This story began with her, and she has the right to choose how to end her part." At Heathrow, Naomi stepped off the plane. No cameras were waiting. Not yet. Just the cool air and the familiar smell of the airport. She pulled her suitcase. She walked away. But deep down, one thing was clear to her. The truth has begun to spread, and once it's come to light, no one can pretend they didn't see it. The morning in London began with a light drizzle. Naomi Brooks pulled her suitcase out of the international arrivals area of Heathrow Airport. There were no reporters waiting. Not yet. Everything outside was strangely normal. People were rushing to work. Taxis were lined up. No one knew that in just a few hours her name would appear on the phone screens of millions. Naomi stopped in front of the window. She saw her reflection. A gray hoodie. A black backpack. A calm face, but her eyes showed signs of fatigue. She wondered, am I ready for what's coming? In New York, the answer has begun to emerge. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the first article appeared on the front page of a major newspaper. It wasn't sensationalist. It wasn't judgmental. It simply listed events in chronological order. But the headline was clear enough to make the reader stop. "Teen passenger pressured to give up first-class seat on Northway flight." The article cites sources from passengers, from video, from indirectly confirmed internal notes. It doesn't mention Naomi by name. It doesn't mention Marcus Brooks. But discerning readers have begun piecing together the fragments. Comments appeared quickly. This is all too familiar. It's always black people who have to prove themselves. How many more times is enough? At Northway Airlines headquarters, the communications room was like a beehive. Phones rang incessantly. Emails poured in. News outlets demanded responses. Investors inquired about brand risk. Sarah Linwood stood in front of the whiteboard, pen in hand. She quickly jotted down bullet points. Official statement. Internal responsibility. Specific actions. Marcus Brooks walked into the room. He didn't speak immediately. He glanced at the large screen where the headlines were updating minute by minute. "How many hours do we have?" he asked. "Not much," Sarah replied. "The story is picking up speed." Marcus nodded. He didn't seem in a hurry, but his gaze was sharper. "Then let's go ahead," he said. "Don't chase after us." He turned to the head of the legal department. "What can we say?" "We can confirm the facts," the person said. "We don't admit to any legal wrongdoing, but we do acknowledge a mistake in how we handled it." Marcus nodded. "Do it," he said. "And one more thing." He paused. "We made it clear that the affected individuals were minors." The room fell silent for a moment. "That would generate stronger public opinion," someone said. Marcus looked at the person. "Yes," he said, "and that's the truth." Meanwhile, back in London, Naomi had arrived at her small apartment where she would be staying during her internship. She put down her suitcase, made a cup of tea, sit by the window. The rain was still falling lightly. Her phone vibrated constantly. Messages from classmates, from acquaintances, from unknown numbers. She didn't answer immediately. She needed time to breathe. She opened a message from her father. "The press will want to interview you. Dad won't make the decision for you." Naomi looked at the screen. She typed and deleted, typed and deleted. Finally, she sent a short message. "I don't know what I want to say yet," Marcus replied almost immediately. "Then you don't need to say anything yet." Naomi put the phone down. She leaned back in her chair. She thought about the crowd, about how they would tell this story, about whether it might become a symbol or a short-lived pastime. She doesn't want to be both. In New York, Northway Airlines issued its first statement. Short, clear, no defensiveness. "We confirm that an incident occurred regarding the handling of seating on flight NW482. The affected passenger was a minor with a valid ticket. We apologize for the experience that did not align with our values. We are conducting an internal investigation and will announce specific actions." The press release was published, shared, analyzed, word for word dissected. Some people praised the transparency. Some said it wasn't enough. But they all agreed Northway couldn't remain silent. On social media, hashtags began to take shape. Number seat 1, a number fly with dignity, number Northway. Another video clip appeared. A different angle, a different time. Naomi's face was still unclear, but it was clear enough to see Linda Hayes standing with her arms crossed. Clear enough to hear Captain Miller talking about flight progress. Public sentiment shifted from curiosity to outrage. "It's not a personal fault," one comment read. "This is the culture." Marcus Brooks sat in the conference room watching those comments. He didn't shy away. He read. He listened. "We'll hold a press conference," he said. "Tomorrow morning." Sarah looked at him. "Are you sure?" Marcus nodded. "Certainly," he said. "If we believe what we say, then we must stand up for it." In London, Naomi opened her laptop. She searched for the article. She read the comments. Not all of them. Only a portion. She saw people who had never met her speaking on her behalf, defending her. But there were also those who doubted her, questioning her privileges, questioning her father. She turned off the machine. She wasn't angry, but she was tired. That evening, Marcus called her. The call was longer than usual. "You don't have to do anything," he said. "No one has the right to demand that you become a representative voice." Naomi was silent for a moment. "But if you remain silent," she said, "someone else will speak for you." Marcus nodded, though Naomi couldn't see it. "Yes," he said. "And if you want to speak, I'll be there. Not in front, behind." Naomi looked outside. The rain had stopped. Streetlights, reflected on the wet ground. "I don't want to tell this story as a victory," she said. "I want it to be a reminder." Marcus smiled very slightly. "Then you understand the most important thing," he said. That night, Naomi wrote a few lines. Not to publish, just to organize her thoughts. Justice shouldn't depend on who you call. But while it still does, we have to talk about it. In New York, the press conference room is prepared. Microphones are set up, Logos are aligned. Reporters register to attend. Public pressure has mounted. But amidst the uproar, one thing has become clear. This story is no longer about a seat. It's about how a system reacts when it's stared at directly in the face. And tomorrow morning, Northway Airlines will have to answer. Mornings in New York start earlier than usual. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large windows of Northway Airlines headquarters, the press conference room on the ground floor was packed with people. Cameras were set up. Microphones were adjusted in height. Notebooks were open, ready to take notes. The atmosphere wasn't noisy. It was tense. A kind of tension, all too familiar to anyone who's ever witnessed a large system undergoing a self-reflection. Marcus Brooks stood in the back waiting room. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't talking much. He adjusted his shirt sleeves, a small but deliberate gesture. Sarah Linwood stood beside him, holding a thin stack of documents. "We've agreed on the message," she said, "but the press will ask more than that." Marcus nodded. "And they should," he said. "If they don't ask, it means we haven't convinced them yet." He looked in the mirror for a very brief moment. Not to check his appearance, but to ask himself, am I telling the truth? In London, Naomi Brooks sits at a small kitchen table. A cup of coffee is slowly cooling in front of her. Her laptop is open. A live television broadcast is about to begin. She wasn't sure she wanted to see it, but she knew she needed to see it. She thought about the moment on the plane, about the feeling of being stared at like a problem that needed solving, and about the question that had haunted her all night. If I hadn't called my dad that day, who would have stood up for me? She took a sip of coffee, bitter, but familiar. In New York, the doors to the press conference room opened. Marcus Brooks stepped up to the microphone. He didn't smile. He wasn't stern, just calm. "Good morning," he said. The camera clicked. The lights shone directly down. Marcus placed his hand on the platform, looking around the room. "Last night, he began an incident occurred on our flight, NW482. A young passenger with a valid ticket was asked to leave his seat to make room for someone else. He paused. No need to rush. That passenger is my daughter," he continued. "But today, I'm not standing here as a father." The room buzzed slightly. "I stand here as CEO of Northway Airlines," he said, "and as the person responsible for the culture this company has created." Naomi sat up straighter when she heard that. Marcus continued, his voice even. "My daughter did nothing wrong. And the point is, the whole thing only stopped when my identity was revealed. That shows there's a much bigger issue than just a seat." He looked directly into the camera. "If justice only comes when power is seized, then it is not justice." The room fell silent. No one took notes for a few seconds. The statement hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Marcus inhaled. "We have temporarily suspended the employees involved, pending an investigation," he said. "But I want to make it clear this is not about blaming individuals. This is about acknowledging a system that allowed such decisions to happen." A reporter raised their hand. "Do you acknowledge that this is discrimination?" she asked. Marcus didn't dodge. "I admit that in that moment my daughter was not treated with the respect that every passenger deserves," he said. "And I admit that prejudices, even unconscious ones, may have influenced the decision." Another reporter asked, "What will Northway do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Marcus looked down at the document, then looked up again. "We will implement mandatory training on conflict resolution and unconscious bias for the entire team," he said. "We will review the process of empowering flight attendants and captains in sensitive situations, and we will establish a separate complaint channel where passengers can be heard without having to be known by a specific name." In London, Naomi closed her eyes for a moment when she heard that. Part of her wanted to believe it. Another part was hesitant. A reporter in the front row asked the question everyone was waiting for. "Mr. Brooks, if your daughter wasn't the CEO's daughter, would the outcome be different?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked directly at the questioner. Then he spoke slowly. "Perhaps," he said, "and that's precisely why I can't remain silent. The answer isn't perfect, but it's honest." The press conference lasted longer than expected. Many questions, many perspectives. Marcus wasn't defensive. He didn't evade. He didn't make vague promises. He only committed to what he could deliver. When the meeting ended, he stepped down, away from the spotlight. Sarah Linwood walked beside him. "He's doing a good job," she said. Marcus shook his head. "I did what needed to be done," he replied. "Whether it turned out well or not, only time will tell." In London, Naomi closed her laptop. The apartment became quiet again. She sat still for a long time. She thought about that question. What if she wasn't the CEO's daughter? She thought about the people who would be watching this press conference. People who had been through something similar but had no one to stand in front of the microphone for them. She opened her phone. A message from a stranger appeared. No criticism, just one sentence. I've been in that situation before. Thank you for not staying silent. Naomi put down the phone. She felt a lump in her throat. Not from sadness, but from realizing that this story had spiraled out of her control in a good way. Marcus called her that afternoon. Did you see the press conference, he asked. Okay, Naomi replied. How do you feel? Naomi thought for a moment. I feel a little lighter, she said, but I also feel a sense of responsibility. Marcus smiled. You owe the world nothing, he said. You just need to be true to yourself. Naomi looked out the window. The London sky had brightened. Sunlight shone on the rain-soaked roof. I don't want to be a brand ambassador, she said, but if this story helps someone stand a little more grounded, then I'll accept it. Marcus was silent for a moment. You've stood firm, he said. Right from the start. The call ended. Naomi sat there alone. She opened her small notebook. She wrote a few lines. There are moments when silence is safe, but there are also moments when silence is tantamount to complicity. Out there, public reaction continues. Some praise it, some are skeptical, some feel it's not enough. But no one is saying anymore that this was just a small misunderstanding. The public statement has been made. And from that moment on, Northway Airlines has no way back. Naomi knew the hardest part was yet to come, not facing the press, but turning words into action. She took a deep breath. The ending of this story has yet to be written, but at least it has begun with the truth. London in the morning has a very different rhythm from New York. Not hurried in a frantic way, not tense like a financial center scrutinizing itself under the spotlight. London was slower, more subdued. And that morning, Naomi Brooks stepped out of her small apartment, zipped up her coat, and blended into the stream of commuters like an anonymous figure. She likes this feeling. No one recognized her. No one asked. No one expected her to say something appropriate. She was just a young girl walking on the dew-covered sidewalk, carrying a backpack, her headphones off. In her mind, the sounds of the past few days still echoed faintly. The sound of airplane engines, the clicking of cameras, the buzzing of microphones in the press conference room. But today, for the first time, they faded into the background. She needed this quiet time. In New York, the repercussions haven't subsided yet. Following the press conference, Northway Airlines continued to announce concrete steps. Not a big statement, but regular, clear, and unembellished updates. Linda Hayes was officially suspended indefinitely pending the conclusion of the investigation. Captain Andrew Miller was temporarily removed from flight duty, and his situational awareness was assessed. An internal cultural audit team was established independent of the day-to-day operations. There are no words like necessary sacrifice. No generic apologies. Only action. Marcus Brooks knew this wouldn't please everyone. Some shareholders were concerned. Some employees were uneasy. A few voices in the media suggested he was overreacting. Marcus accepted that. In a closed-door meeting, a manager asked him, "Are you afraid that this precedent will make employees hesitant to make decisions?" Marcus replied, his voice calm. "I'm afraid employees will make decisions without asking themselves if this person didn't have the power. Would I do things differently?" The room was silent. In London, Naomi began her first day at the company where she was interning. A small lab, white lights, the sound of computers running in the background. No one there cared about Seat 1A. No one asked about the airline. They asked her about data, about models, about the hypotheses she was testing. Naomi liked that. During her lunch break, she sat alone by the window. Her phone rang. A text message from Marcus. "Dad just signed the final decision," Naomi read. Her heart beat a little faster. Regarding Linda Hayes and Captain Miller, Marcus continued his message. The investigation concluded that there were serious errors in the handling of the situation. There was an element of bias in the assessment of the circumstances. Naomi looked outside. The London sky that day was bluer than it had been the previous few days. "Will they be fired?" she texted back. The three dots appeared for longer than usual. "Linda's contract will be terminated," Marcus replied. "Captain Miller is suspended for an extended period and required to undergo mandatory retraining. Failure to comply will result in his return to the cockpit." Naomi put down the phone. She didn't feel triumphant. Nor did she feel completely relieved. She just felt a cycle had ended. She thought about Linda Hayes, about the look in her eyes on the plane, about how small a power when left unchecked could inflict such great harm. She thought about Captain Miller, about the phrase flight schedule, about how safety and dignity are sometimes placed on opposite sides of the scale, and she thought about herself. If she had stood up and walked to the back of the plane that day, this story wouldn't have existed. No press conference. No investigation. No changes. But there is no hope either. A few days later, a lengthy article was published in a major magazine. No sensational headlines. No shocking images. Just an in-depth analysis of power, prejudice, and how large organizations often only change when forced to confront their true nature. The article doesn't center around Naomi. It asks the question, how many stories like this have never been told simply because not a single call was answered? Naomi read the article that evening. She closed her laptop after she finished reading. She didn't share it. She didn't comment. She just sat there for a long time. A week has passed. On social media, the initial frenzy gradually subsided. Hashtags became less frequent. New news emerged overshadowing the old. That's just how it is for the masses. But inside Northway Airlines, some things were different. The training sessions have just begun. Not just empty slides, but real discussions, real situations, and challenging questions. A young flight attendant raises her hand to ask a question during a training session. If that passenger has no status, what should we do when we're under pressure from others? The instructor did not provide a sample answer. You stop, she said, and you ask yourself, is this decision fair if no one sees it? In New York, Marcus Brooks left the office later than usual. The city lights were on. He stood in front of the window, watching the people below. He thought about Naomi, about how his daughter had matured a little faster just because of one flight. He also thought about his responsibility, not just as a father, but as the head of a system that could harm or protect millions of people. In London, Naomi received an email from a stranger, an older black woman who introduced herself as a retired teacher. I was once asked to change seats on a flight 20 years ago, the email read. I complied because I was tired. I just wanted to go home. When I read your story, I cried. Not because I was angry, but because I wish I had been calm enough to say no back then. Naomi read that email twice. She replied very briefly. Thank you for sharing. I think that your continued existence and sharing your story is also a way for you to stay strong. She sent it. Then she put the phone down. That evening, Naomi called Marcus. The call was short. Do you regret being so blunt, Dad? She asked. Marcus chuckled softly. I regret not creating a better system sooner, he said. But I don't regret speaking out. Naomi was silent for a moment. I don't want to be remembered for this story, she said. I won't, Marcus replied. I'll be remembered for what I do next. Naomi looked out the window. The lights of London reflected on the glass. She thought about the future, about work, about other flights, about the spaces where she would step into places not to prove herself worthy, but simply to be present. She understood that the world wouldn't change just because of a story, but she also understood that no change begins with absolute silence. This story doesn't end with a resounding victory. There's no applause, no grand pronouncements. It concludes with smaller things. A process is fixed. A question is asked. Someone somewhere next time won't get up from their seat so quickly. And Naomi Brooks, the girl who was once asked to leave seat 1A, goes on with her life. Not as an icon, but as a person. Calm, empathetic, and strong enough to say no when necessary. Naomi Brooks's story isn't just about a flight. It's about familiar moments in life, when people are asked to step back not because they're wrong, but because they aren't inherently where they belong. The biggest lesson of this story isn't have power. Rather, it's that justice shouldn't depend on who you are, who you know, or who you call. But in a society that's far from perfect, simply standing firm, even calmly, is an act of courage. For adult viewers, perhaps we've all experienced this feeling, staying silent to avoid trouble because we're tired, giving in to avoid conflict because we don't want to fuss. And sometimes that very silence allows the wrong things to continue happening. Naomi didn't win with anger. She won with composure, clarity, and self-respect. She didn't humiliate anyone. She didn't seek revenge. She simply said, "This is my place. Perhaps the lesson for all of us is when you know you're right, you don't need to raise your voice, you just need to stand your ground. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you found the content valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling gentle, authentic stories that are thought-provoking. We'll meet again in the next story.